When the French Revolution broke out, the Kingdom of Prussia was in a comfortable position. It was recognized as one of the major powers of Europe, if on the lower end of that scale. Its army was viewed with respect, still riding high off the accomplishments of Frederick the Great. France, crippled by their ongoing revolution, opened up massive opportunities for territorial expansion for Prussia at the cost of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While Prussia failed in its efforts to support the French monarchy during the War of the First Coalition, it lost little during the conflict and would not even fight France during the Second Coalition War. All of this would come crumbling down in 1806 as Prussia would be decisively defeated at the battles of Jena Austadt by Napoleon. The Prussian army was not just defeated. In the days and weeks that followed, it fully disintegrated as it began surrendering to the French en masse. When peace finally came, it would be devastating to Prussian prestige and power. Prussia would be forced to give up 50% of its territory, including much of its Polish gains. The remainder of the country was occupied by French troops, and Prussia was forced into becoming a French ally. Napoleon, for a time, had even considered fully ending the Kingdom of Prussia and dividing up its territories amongst his allies. He eventually decided against this, in part thanks to the intervention of Tsar Alexander, who supported Prussia during the Treaty of Tilsit. Defeated, humiliated, and reduced to a shadow of its former glory, Prussia found itself at its greatest low. Then it did something that would surprise the great powers of Europe, and particularly Napoleon. Prussia rebuilt itself, reestablished itself as a major power, and by the end of the Napoleonic Wars was in a stronger position than when it had went into it. How it accomplished all of this, going from disaster to success, is a story of careful planning and biding one's time until the moment was right. There were a number of factors that led to Prussia's disastrous defeat in 1806. In hindsight, not committing to the destruction of the revolution during the First Coalition War against the French Republic was a mistake. Any gains made by choosing to focus on dividing up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Russia were short-lived. Another critical mistake was Prussia's decision to remain neutral with France for so long before finally declaring war only after Austria was defeated. It made sense during the War of the Second Coalition to remain neutral in the conflict. Prussia had very little to gain from joining the war against France when so many of the other great powers of Europe were involved in the conflict. By the time of the Third Coalition, however, it was becoming clear that France under Napoleon was gaining power at an alarming rate. Frederick William III, who ruled Prussia during this period, was against war generally, and unfortunately was often indecisive when it came to making important decisions. While many urged for war against France, most notably his wife, Queen Louise, who had a particular dislike of Napoleon, Frederick hesitated. Ultimately, he delayed too long, missing what would have been his best opportunity to join Austria and Russia against Napoleon during the Third Coalition. The defeat of the combined Austrian-Russian army at Austerlitz would force Austria to surrender, and force Russia to pull back what remained of its army to its home territory. Neither would be in a position to aid Prussia when it declared war on France roughly a year later. It would be Napoleon's growing influence in Germany, with the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, that finally pushed Frederick to make war. To Frederick, the Confederation of the Rhine was simply too great a threat to Prussia's own influence in Germany. Even without the aid of Austria or Russia, Prussia on paper looked quite strong, and able to meet the French in open battle. What was hidden from view was the stagnation and rot present within the army. The fighting against France during the First Coalition had been more limited, and as a result, the true scale of issues present within the Prussian army would not come to light until 1806. Prussia has simply not fought a true war since the 7 Years' War under Frederick the Great. Since the great victories of the 7 Years' War, the Prussian army had stagnated. It had failed to keep up with the advancements of other European militaries. Its officers were often aging aristocrats. Its infantry was made up of conscripts and mercenaries, and prioritized the strict discipline for its tactics developed during Frederick the Great's time. Prussia's traditional and by 1806 outdated army stood in stark contrast to the French, who had not only years of recent fighting experience, but had made significant advancements in both tactics and organization. The revolution had stripped out the old aristocratic officers, bringing in an influx of young talent put in charge of vast amounts of men as the early republic fought a war on all fronts for its very survival. Napoleon had further refined the army, consolidating the lessons learned during the first two coalition wars when he created his Grand Armée. When it marched to give battle to the Prussians, the French army was the most capable army in Europe, at the cutting edge of military theory and ability. When these two forces met, the The results were the dual battles of Jena and Austerlitz, in which both proved a disaster for the outdated Prussian forces. At Jena, the dispersed and passive Prussians were outmaneuvered by Napoleon, who decisively defeated the forces before him. The Prussians would lose over half of the roughly 50,000 men involved at Jena, some 15,000 taken prisoner. The greater defeat would come at Austerlitz at the hands of Marshal Davout. Here the Prussians significantly outnumbered the French, some 60,000 Prussians versus just 25,000 French. Despite their number advantage, the Prussians would fail to break the French with a frontal assault and would be counterattacked in turn. The Duke of Brunswick, who was overall in command of the Prussian army, would be mortally wounded during the battle, and the army as a whole would be forced to retreat shortly after. The dual defeats were devastating, not only due to the losses suffered in the two battles, nearly half the army dead, wounded, or captured, but also in the way it shattered the army's morale. Over the coming days, tens of thousands more would surrender to the French as they ruthlessly pursued the remnants of the army. In the following weeks, nearly the entirety of Prussia would be occupied by the French as they marched on, seizing Berlin before turning to face the Russians. King Frederick, along with his wife Queen Louise, were forced to flee to Memel. Despite several offers to make peace by Napoleon, Frederick decided to bet the fate of Prussia on the success of the Russian forces. That hope would be shattered at Friedland, as a Russian defeat there prompted Russia to seek peace with Napoleon. Despite support from Tsar Alexander, and even an attempt by Queen Louise personally to appeal to Napoleon directly for a lighter peace, Napoleon would decide to punish Prussia severely. While he would go so far as to consider dismantling the Kingdom of Prussia entirely, he would ultimately concede mainly to the desires of Tsar Alexander to allow Prussia's continued existence. The Kingdom of Prussia would lose half its territory, including its Polish lands gained during the Second and Third Partitions, which would be turned into the Duchy of Warsaw. It would also lose all its German lands west of the Elbe River, which would become part of the newly created Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome. These territorial losses would also see Prussia's population reduced from 9 million to less than 5 million. Napoleon also forced Prussia to pay a war debt of 120 million francs, and pay for the cost of maintaining the country's own occupation by over 100,000 French troops. From 1806 onward, Prussia would be forced into alliance with Napoleonic France, forced to follow its lead on the European stage. All of these losses were devastating to Prussia. The weaknesses that railed the country were not only laid bare, but exploited to devastating effect. Once peace came, it was clear to all that Prussia had to change. It had stagnated for far too long, and if it had any hope of regaining its losses, it would have to enact major changes. Under the crippling weight of its financial debts to France, a general movement of widespread reforms rapidly gained traction. Though the king was hesitant to support major reforms, the queen was a supporter of the general effort, and the combined efforts of reformers would convince Frederick to support wide-sweeping changes to the Prussian state over the coming years. As a whole, though the reform movement faced opposition, primarily from the nobility who saw it as attempting to reduce their influence, the movement was successful in enacting wide-sweeping reforms that radically changed Prussian society. Perhaps the biggest reform was the end of serfdom and the following push for greater involvement of Prussian citizenry in their local community. Everywhere, the old complex systems of government, tax, and industry were reorganized. The aim of these reforms was multifaceted. Economically, internal barriers to trade and industry were removed. Guilds no longer held a monopoly on industry, and farmers were able to now own their lands that they worked. Towns and cities saw their rules and regulations standardized, removing all the old special privileges that many such places had. In general, the effect of these reforms saw the Prussian bureaucracy expand, as the government did away with the old system of cabinets, being replaced with ministers responsible for various areas of government. There was a minister for the interior, minister for foreign affairs, minister for finances, minister for justice, and of course the minister of war. All of these ministers would answer to the king, but in practice this actually reduced the king's power, as he was forced to act through his ministers. Of course, the most important reforms in the short term were not those to Prussia's economy or state, but to its army. From the beginning, the reforms to the army had one objective in mind: defeating Napoleon. The Treaty of Tilsit restricted the Prussian army to just 42,000 men for a period of 10 years. This fact, while only adding to the humiliation Prussia suffered, in some ways helped to mask the changes taking place in the army. Reformers in the army included a number of high-profile officers of the time, such as Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the best known today, Clausewitz. These reformers naturally took inspiration from the French, as the combination of the French Revolution and Napoleon had created the finest army in Europe. Of particular interest was the transformation of the army from a small, limited force of professional conscripted soldiers and mercenaries to an army based on mass conscription. For Germany in particular, the Napoleonic War saw the beginning stages of German nationalism take hold, as the general population of Germany grew increasingly hostile to Napoleon and his French occupation. Scharnhorst and other reformers took hold of this idea of popular resistance against Napoleon and aimed to make an army based on mass conscription, motivated by its shared desire to rid the German lands of the French. General reforms, such as the freeing of the serfs, was necessary to even make this possible, but once that was accomplished, the next step was dealing with how to bypass the serious restrictions placed on the size of the Prussian army. To get around this restriction, the army would create the Krumper system. Conscripts would be trained and rotate out of the army before new conscripts would be trained, and the whole system would repeat itself. This allowed the army to in only a few years train over 150,000 troops, while never actually going over its treaty limits. How the army was trained would also see major reforms, with the old harsh disciplinary measures and inflexibility replaced with ideas more along French lines. Prussia's officer corps, too, would see changes, and most officers would be dismissed following a defeat in 1806, paving the way for new officers not set in the old ways to rise through the ranks, a large number of the reformers being amongst this number. The old Prussian War College was closed following 1806, and would only be refounded in 1810 to teach the new ways of war. Officers were no longer completely restricted to the nobility either, as the middle class was allowed to become officers on the basis of merit. Over the course of 5 years, the Prussian army reformed its organization, supply, training, and how its officers were selected. The reforms would reach all corners of the military, as infantry, cavalry, and artillery were integrated at the tactical level. The equipment was improved alongside the army's logistics, as the old static way of war was replaced with tactics that emphasized speed and flexibility. While the reforms would not be fully completed by 1813, when Prussia went to war with France once more, they had done enough to ensure Prussia was ready to avenge their defeat of 1806. 1812 would see Prussia forced to contribute part of its army to Napoleon's invasion of Russia. This action would be vehemently opposed by many Prussian officers, who would resign their posts in protest, some of whom would even leave to join the Russians to fight against Napoleon. The disaster in Russia, however, would give Prussia the chance to strike back against Napoleon that it had long waited for. On December 30th, 1812, Prussian forces in Russia under General York would sign an armistice with Russia with the Convention of Torreon, removing the Prussian troops that fought against Russia from the war. News of the armistice was met with great enthusiasm from the Prussian people and the army. Since York had not been given permission to make such a decision, however, and many retreating French troops were still in eastern Prussia at the time, King Frederick ordered York's removal. Frederick was nervous about renewing war with France, even with its recent defeat in Russia. As the scale of the defeat became clear, and public outcry to take advantage of the moment to strike against France grew, Frederick decided to officially switch sides. On February 28, 1813, Prussia would sign the Treaty of Calais, starting the War of the Sixth Coalition. The mood in Prussia and Germany as a whole was set against France, who had used its resources for years to support Napoleon's wars. While most of Germany was still under French control, through various German states still committed to the Confederation of the Rhine, the mood had shifted. In the eyes of many Germans, the fighting that followed would be a war of German liberation. The Prussian army was able to rapidly mobilize both its army and large forces of Landwehr, Prussian militia. Together with the Russians, the new and improved Prussian army would march forward to give battle against Napoleon. All of this, however, took time. Prussia had to mobilize for war, and Russia had to recover from its winter pursuit of Napoleon, which, despite its success, was still costly for the Russian army. Napoleon took advantage of the time it took his enemies to mobilize against him, and rapidly set about rebuilding his army however possible. It would not be anything like the grand army that had marched into Russia, but it could still fight. In May, the combined Prussian and Russian armies would fight 2 major battles against the French. Both would be defeats for the coalition. These failures put the coalition in a bad state, but was not without some success. The French faced similar casualties in both battles, and most of the army being made up of fresh conscripts, was increasingly disorganized. Napoleon's lack of cavalry following the Russian invasion also made it difficult to exploit his victories. Neither side was in a great state to continue the fighting, but the French had the advantage and might have been able to press it. Instead, Napoleon agreed to a ceasefire with the Allies. Both sides agreed to the armistice of Plaswitz, which went into effect on June 4th and would last until August 13th. During this time, all sides worked to rebuild their forces, and critically for the coalition, convince Austria to join the war on their side. Austria officially joining the coalition in August would signal the end of the armistice. Nearly 100,000 Prussians would take part in the climactic battle of the war at Leipzig, and Prussian forces would play a major role in the advance all the way to Paris. Upon Napoleon's brief return in 1815, it would be the Prussians along with the British that would deal the final blow to Napoleon, defeating him once and for all. When the time came at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the maps of Europe, Prussia would have one of the primary seats at the table. Despite its embarrassing defeat in 1806, despite its years of subservience to France, and despite numerous other stronger powers arguably contributing more to defeating Napoleon, Prussia would be a major player in the Congress of Vienna. A great deal of this was the result of divisions between the competing great powers that Prussia was able to benefit from. In particular, Prussia aligned itself with Russia to press their claims in Poland and Saxony, even moving troops to prepare for the possibility of conflict against the other great powers. Conflict would not come, however, and eventually a deal would be reached that saw Prussia generously compensated for giving up parts of its former Polish land to Russia and not fully annexing Saxony. Out of all the nations present at the Congress of Vienna, Prussia was perhaps the one that benefited the most, with Russia coming in a close second. Prussia would regain the territory of Posen, which had lost the Duchy of Warsaw, and mostly matched the original territory it had gained during the Second Partition of Poland. The rest of Polish territory, along with what Prussia had once controlled following the Third Partition, would go to Russia. In exchange, Prussia would gain 3/5 of Saxony, along with significant territories along the Rhine and Westphalia. Sweden would also give up its territory in Pomerania to Denmark, who would promptly sell it to Prussia. Altogether, Prussia would more than double in terms of both size and population from its low point during the Napoleonic Wars. Importantly, this included the Ruhr, the growing base of industry in Germany. Coming out of the Napoleonic period, Prussia was larger and better organized thanks to the reform movement, which would extend even beyond the end of the wars against Napoleon. In the following decades, Prussia would only solidify its position as a major power in Europe, as industrialization began in full force and Prussia continued to invest heavily in the ongoing modernization of its army, unwilling to make the same mistakes of the past. Eventually, Prussia's rise and the stagnation of its neighbors, particularly Austria, would culminate in the formation of a united Germany under Prussian leadership.